So today I thought I'd respond to another one of my subscribers' videos.
They've been labelled selfish, reckless and appalling, but Australian White Lives Don't Matter protesters are finally getting national attention.
I think claiming Australia's White Lives Don't Matter protests is kind of cheapening what you say because, for one thing, that's not what she said. Nobody says that. And for another thing, I mean, it's kind of just making it seem like you're attacking the movement for what it's for, which means that you don't necessarily understand the movement.
But you see, what you don't understand, Natalie, is that disrespecting white lives don't matter is the civic duty of every decent, law-abiding citizen who washes more than once a month.
See, again, I have a problem with this because, for one thing, I mean, you're implying that black people do not wash, or the people who support Black Lives Matter do not wash. Now, I do agree that segregation is a problem, whether it's protests or anything like that, but these people do feel like that they don't have a voice, so let them speak.
It seems odd to me that a religious ideology that disrespects law and order, disrespects history, disrespects white people based solely on their race, disrespects monuments, disrespects public and private property, and disrespects our whole way of life, is concerned about being disrespected.
Again, I don't disagree with further segregation creates more problems down the line, but I think that you're ignoring what they're saying.
When Australians talk about Black Lives Matter, their viewpoint is usually the same. Of course they matter, but protest later, not in the middle of a pandemic. But where is the evidence these protests, which are done with COVID safety at the forefront, have triggered any outbreaks?
Actually, I believe that they did look into this and they determined that the protest was not an underlining factor in terms of the outbreaks. Yes, it was related per se, but the second wave actually occurred maybe very similar timing. I forget the dates, but the second wave was not just because of the protest or anything. In fact, I think that they found that there was very little amount of people who were at the protest that actually got COVID. A lot of it, for instance, in Victoria, was in places like Wyndham Vale and Casey and like places like that. So, I mean, it is what it is, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the protests were the defining factor. In my last video, I showed some footage of what people in country Victoria were doing. So, I mean, those people weren't at the protests.
Victoria's health department denied its state's second wave of coronavirus had been triggered by protests. 6 people who attended Melbourne's largest White Lives Don't Matter protest in June later tested positive for coronavirus.
So if we look here, we've got in Australia on June the 1st, 7,195 cases. So if we go over to Australia on June 30th, 7,767 cases. So if we grab my calculator, we'll do 7,767 take 7,195. So in June, in the period of June, when the Black Lives Matter protests happened, we had 572 cases. So if we take away the Black Lives Matter people, the 6 that he is claiming, so take away 6, so 566 cases were not related to the Black Lives Matter protests, allegedly. Obviously, some of those people did probably transmit to other people, but the majority of cases probably came from elsewhere. Say, the hotel quarantine thing that we had, or people coming in from different countries, people going to places that they're not supposed to be people refusing to wear masks, people just basically doing the wrong thing. So,
However, a department spokesperson admitted currently no known nor suspected episodes of transmission occurred at the protest itself.
That may well be the case. You have no idea where these people may have contracted COVID-19 from. They may have gotten it from, going to the doctors or being in an area that has the problems, You simply can't possibly know.
Yeah, it's like the virus knew to not infect those that fight for such a worthy cause.
No one's made that claim. In fact, what's probably more likely is the fact that people were making the claim of that COVID is a hoax, or that masks don't work, or that all this kind of stuff. They were making claims about how it's a scheme by the government and yada yada yada, blah blah blah.
Of course, you can't go to grandma's funeral with a dozen family members for fear of spreading coronavirus. You can't take your dog for a walk along the beach for fear of spreading coronavirus.
If you lived near the beach, I don't know of a time where you couldn't take your dog for a walk on the beach. At the moment, the strictest we've had it is being in a 5-kilometer radius. And if you live near the beach, if it's within 5 kilometers, then yeah, you can take your dog for a walk on the beach.
You can't go and have a beer with 3 of your mates for fear of spreading coronavirus, but you can gather 20,000 fucking strong in a huddle. But don't worry, there's just no way a 20,000 person gathering will spread the virus.
See, I don't disagree that the protest shouldn't have happened at the time that it did, because yeah, it was a stupid thing to do. But my problem here is the fact that you're, blaming the protest for COVID-19, which was not one of the defining factors. There was a lot more to it. B, you're blaming the protest for racism against white people. The reason why people feel like they need to do a protest is because they feel like that they're not being heard. So they're trying to protest to stop the community so they can see that it's a sort of problem that's going on.
Because according to Natalie the airhead, it was done with COVID safety at the forefront. Yeah, if COVID safety was forefront, you wouldn't hold a rally in the first place, because COVID safety as a first priority would compel you not to.
You also have to remember that we had a lot less information back then about COVID to what we have now. A lot of people were, speculating that it wasn't real, and they were taking off their masks. They were, protesting the actual lockdowns and actual restrictions and everything. You can't say that this was purely a Black Lives Matter problem.
And what changed because of your rally? Did the invented boogeyman of white supremacy end? No. Did an upsurge in COVID cases occur pretty much exactly 2 weeks after the protests? Yes.
Have you made any friends that are of any other culture or race? Because if you walk with them, you'll see how much they're judged by people. I have had friends who are Muslim who have been judged for what they wear and attacked even. And I've seen people make comments to them saying, you're a letterbox. I've had friends that are Asian, and honestly, people fetishize those people. I've had black friends, they got treated weirdly. And this is stuff that I never mentally thought of, but other people call them out on the street. There is a racism problem in Australia, but there is also racism towards white people too. So for instance, I will walk through an Aboriginal based area. I'm not gonna name where I used to live, but I used to get frequently called ghost and attacked for being white, And to be frank, racism comes in all forms, but it still exists. It doesn't, just because you don't believe it doesn't mean that it's not real. There's racism towards white people, there's racism towards Hispanics, it's towards Japanese people, towards black people, but the Black Lives Movement is strictly designed for, black people to say their voices. I just don't like the fact that you're trying to claim that there is no racism towards them when there is.
But the health department said there was no transmission at the protests, and they would know because they're a state government entity, or to put it more precisely, a Labor communist anti-conservative left-wing government entity. So it's hardly surprising that a government body under the auspices of a far-left communist government would come out and say that their far-left comrades don't transmit viruses to each other.
The joke here in Australia is we're not really far left or far right. We've got the Labor Party, which is what he's referring to, and we've got the Liberals. Now, the Labor Party is the better party in my opinion, because they tend to be for the community. They tend to be for boosting education, boosting hospitals, all of that kind of stuff. And the Liberals tend to be the ones who pour the money into businesses and make their friends rich. So that's a thing. And it's kind of ironic that you would want to support that.
I'm guessing the virus is most likely to just be spread by filthy white supremacist types. Our politicians have done an incredible job during the coronavirus pandemic and have been praised around the world for taking a step back from the podium and allowing the experts and doctors to take the reins.
Yeah, we're not going to mention the security having sex with, the quarantine people.
Even though what she just said isn't true in any way at all.
I mean, as far as I know, it is true that the politicians have been listening to, advice. Hence the fact that they didn't hire certain people. I'm not even gonna go into that because a lot has happened since he made this video that he could not possibly have known.
So why aren't the politicians embracing the evidence now? The evidence that there's been zero coronavirus outbreaks from White Lives Don't Matter protests.
Well, to be honest, we can't possibly know where they got those things from. In fact, I actually do believe that they contact traced those people, and those people didn't actually get it from the Black Lives Matter protests. I believe that they were able to contact trace them to other places, which led to the hotel quarantine situation. I am not 100% solid on that, but I believe I read that at some point.
Or even the advice that when Australians aren't able to social distance, they should wear a mask and maintain hand hygiene. Exactly what protesters have promised to do. Yes, those protesters are just a shining example of how people should behave. And yeah, there's no evidence that the explosion of COVID cases in Victoria had anything to do with White Lives Don't Matter.
Wait a minute, this isn't even footage from Victoria at all. I don't believe. I'm gonna take a look at this. This is Google Maps, right? I've looked up our city north faces because that is clearly shown on a corner. Now, we have two north faces in the city. We've got this one on Burke Street, and we got this one at DFO. So, this one's a shopping centre. This one, I'm not exactly sure. I feel like this place just sells the brand, but I don't think that this place has a sign. It might do. Let's just go drop in. Actually, before we drop our little guy, before we do that, first I'm going to give you a street view of where it is. So, as you can see here, it's not on a corner at all, right? In the video, it showed on a corner. So what we're going to do is we're going to plop our little guy right at the front of North Face. Okay? So I assume I would be facing... Oh wait, I should be facing this way. So I believe the North Face Police is actually in this little shopping centre here. So as you can see, we don't even have a sign for it outside. Now, if we go to, let's go to this intersection here. So you can also see a big teller of what our streets look like. Because in Melbourne, we have trams. We have basically what looks like train tracks all over our streets in Melbourne. And that is probably a big indicator that it is indeed not footage from Melbourne either. So, I mean, this is Elizabeth Street. This is probably one of the more popular roads. There are a few roads that don't have tram tracks, like these small roads, but you can see that on intersections, they always have crossing lights in the city, even if it's a one-way street. So that's also another indicator that it's not Melbourne. You'll also notice that our city is quite colourful. Like, we've got this building. This is H&M in there. There's also like a lot of roads on there, but if I can turn down this street here. So this is my old street. I used to live on this street, Lonsdale Street. And you'll see that even with the roads that are not trams, like, our roads look slightly different to that footage that was there. Now, that did say King 5 on it, so let's give the benefit of the doubt. We do have a King Street, so we're gonna get to the bottom of this. Let me just look up King Street, Victoria, okay? So, as you can see, we have found King Street. So, I mean, I'm not seeing a North Face on King Street at all. So, I mean, if I'm brutally honest, I'm starting to not really trust the source.
Well, except for the fact that everyone warned that the protest would probably cause an outbreak. In this graph, we see that for 2 months we had coronavirus pretty much beaten. But then on June 6, you guys decided to hold your White Lives Don't Matter stunt. And then almost exactly 2 weeks later, the infection rate started to take off.
Now, considering that most of these numbers have actually come from Victoria, we've already figured it out, bro. We've already figured it out that the security guards should have just not fucked the people in hotel quarantine, and then COVID would have been fine. They traced everything pretty much to the hotel quarantine and not to Black Lives Matter.
And sorry, what's regarded as the average incubation period for coronavirus again?
2 weeks. 2 weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks. That's what I thought it was.
Yes, but we've already established that there was a lot more variables that came with this, such as people coming back into Australia, people just not believing it, people not wearing masks, not being hygienic, having parties, going out, going on holiday trips rather than like staying isolated and in quarantine like they were supposed to. I mean, people were saying, but it's such a lovely day, I want to go to the beach. That was on the news. So, I mean, there was a lot of variables that came with this, and blaming Black Lives Matter just seems like that you're looking for an excuse to be racist.
It's wild to think that it took the footage of an African American man being suffocated to death by a white police officer on the other side of the world to trigger widespread interest here. Well, I don't know what's so wild about it. I mean, the sheep will sheeple. It's tragic because Australia had its own George Floyd more than 4 years ago. The horrific footage of Mr. Floyd, which showed him begging for his life and telling the police officer more than 20 times that he couldn't breathe, rightfully triggered global outrage.
I mean, to be frank, I agree with you here in the sense of, like, it shouldn't take one incident with one cop to have people step up and not be racist. But, like, at the end of the day, people react to stimulus.
Amongst people who don't really concern themselves with the actual crimes that these people committed.
Again, I agree with you that, like, with people who commit crimes and all that, that should not be disregarded just because of their skin color. That's racism in itself. However, I do disagree with trying to put the whole movement or trying to cheapen the whole movement just because of that one factor, because that's not what it's all about. And there are certainly people who make it into a joke because they're like, white people are terrible and they're racist all the time and, you know, privilege and all that kind of shit. Because I'll be the first person to stand up and say that, like, I don't personally believe in white privilege or black privilege or any privilege. I think that people are born into certain circumstances. They use the tools that they've got to make themselves either a good person, a bad person, or a better person, or a lazy person, whatever they do. But you get given a set of tools when you're born, and it's your choice what you make with those tools. And I don't personally believe race has anything to do with that, because people who are brought up in poor circumstances, I grew up in a poor circumstance family. Like, my dad, like, I spent time with him in jail. I was a person who was, you know, raped when I was younger. I have been bullied my whole life. I was beaten up by people for my race. Just because I was white, I was beaten up. But just because shit things happen to me doesn't mean that every person of those races that did stuff to me, or every person who was near me in certain circumstances, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a good person or a bad person. You should treat each person as their own individual. And the point of Black Lives Matter is that a lot of black people feel like that they're put into this category and put into a box. And I mean, yeah, like, I get why they do it. I do feel like some of them do use it as an excuse to treat white people badly. And I feel like that's wrong in its sense as well. And I think that each person should just treat each person well, and the world would be better. Anyway, this video is getting too long, so I'm just gonna stop it here. Like, honestly, this is a cringe fest. If you've been watching this far, let me know if you like the Skyrim gameplays in the background of the video. I've been in a mood, so